Hi, thanks for being with me today. I'm Jeff Stark. This is the 10th video in a series of videos that we've titled Quarreling and Fighting. We have 10 of these particular videos, and a subset that we've been looking at recently is this matter of defensiveness, when we get defensive in quarreling and fighting. And we've had two earlier videos titled Defensiveness Number 1, Defensiveness Number 2, and today is Defensiveness Number 3. Number 1, we looked at what is defensiveness, what does it look like, what does it sound like, how does it act, how can we identify a person in ourselves or another person as to when we are being defensive. And then secondly, in the second video, we began to look at two reasons why a person gets defensive. And we saw, number one, that a person gets defensive because of pride. Pride is a person who has a high opinion of themselves, and someone is coming in and saying, I disagree with that, you're this, you're that, and this person, the proud person who has a high view of themselves, will defend or get defensive about the fact that that is not correct. This is really where I am, or at least where I think I am, and will turn around and actually attack the person who may be quarreling and fighting with. That's one reason why people get defensive, is we have a high view of ourselves and we get annoyed and upset and defensive when someone might disagree with that. And in our defensiveness, we can turn and attack the person who might be calling into question my good opinion of myself. Today we want to look at the second reason as to why we get defensive. Let's start by looking at Luke chapter 6 and reminding ourselves of something that's very, very important as we look at this matter of not only quarreling and fighting, but also defensiveness. Jesus is extremely helpful in chapter 6 when he talks about a good tree that has good fruit, and a tree that has bad fruit must come from a tree that has a bad root. And he says this: a good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart. This is verse 45. And the evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart. For out of the overflow of his heart, the mouth speaks. And so Jesus is using this agricultural metaphor to give us an understanding of ourselves. The root of who we are and how we behave and how we act and how we react and the choices that we make and how we worship resides and originates in what the Bible calls our hearts. If our hearts happen to be good, then what will be coming out of us will be good words, for example, or good actions or good attitudes. But Jesus says, if the heart is bad, then what's going to be coming out of me will be bad things. Listen again. For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. If the heart is overflowing with a good heart, well, what will be overflowing and coming out of my mouth will be good words. However, if I find that I'm speaking badly, poorly, sinfully, then I would have to ask myself the question, well, why am I doing that? And Jesus is saying, take it back to the heart. And what you'll understand is, at that point in time, you have a bad heart. So here's my question. Extremely helpful advice. Amazingly helpful advice by Christ. So here's the question we want to ask ourselves. Defensiveness. When I am behaving in a defensive manner, quarreling, fighting, being annoyed, reactionary, attacking the person, raising my voice, when I'm behaving that way, is that good fruit or is that bad fruit? Which would you say? When I'm acting and reacting and speaking in that way, is that good fruit or would we say that's bad fruit? Well, we'd have to say it's bad fruit. There's no question about that. The fruit of the Spirit of a good heart is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. But there's nothing of that to be found when you and I are getting defensive. It's quite the other way around. It's anger, it's rude, it's defensive, it's quarreling, it's mean, it's attacking, it's demeaning, it's critical, it's judgmental. Now, where does all that come from? When I'm talking and reacting in that way, well, it originates back into my heart. So what's going on? What does it mean to have a bad heart? And when I have a bad heart, that it comes out with quarreling and fighting and defensiveness in the way that we've described here. What's going on in my heart? Well, in Mark chapter 7, Jesus is very, very helpful to us, once again, as always, when he says this about, he's talking to the Pharisees, and for our purposes, we'll have to be very brief here, but in Matthew chapter 7, Jesus says concerning this religious people, he says in chapter 7 of Mark, verse 6, it says, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain, and their teachings are but rules taught by men. Isn't that interesting? Here are these religious people. With their lips, something's being done with their lips. They honor with their lips, but their hearts are far from him. Their lips may be speaking good things, but Jesus is able to look at the heart and understand that their hearts can be far from God. Now, when our hearts are far from God, we can pretend and speak good things. But when we're quarreling and fighting and getting defensive, and when we take it back to our heart, then we understand that the heart in that particular situation is far from God. A heart that has drifted away from God, a heart that has walked away from God, a heart that has abandoned God, a heart that has chosen to be a friend of the world and an enemy of the Lord, when the heart moves in that direction and becomes bad, well then what's going to be coming out of me are either lips that may honor him, but they're going to be faking and pretending and hypocritical, or more likely, and for our purposes, when our hearts are far from the Lord, and I find myself in a situation of a dialogue with somebody else, I can very easily and will probably inevitably end up quarreling and fighting and being defensive. Or in other words, let's look at it the other way around. When I am quarreling, when I am fighting, and when I find myself being defensive and I take it back to my heart, then what you'll find out that what Jesus is saying here is true, and that is my heart is far from the Lord. I'm not walking intimately with him. I have drifted away from him. I have a trusting and relying and depending upon myself. My confidence is not in him. My confidence is in myself. My heart is far from him, and what's coming out of that heart that is far from him is defensiveness and reactionary and loud and abrasive and attacking and so forth and so on. Now, we can be far from the Lord for a long period of time and see that come out of our hearts and out of our mouths and out of our attitudes and actions for a long time and never really put it together. And most people don't really. You know why? Most people really don't understand what we're talking about, because when you were to ask them, why are you getting angry? Why are you quarreling? Why are you being defensive? What would they say? Well, it's my children, it's my dog, it's my boss, it's that, it's that jerk on the road. And they would blame shift, or excuse, or rationalize, or defend why they're behaving so poorly on their externals. Jesus, is not about the externals. It's about your heart. The reason you're behaving and acting and talking in a defensive manner is because of what's going on in your heart. Your heart is far from me, therefore you have a bad heart, and that's why you're speaking defensively in a bad way. Okay? Now, as I was saying, this can be going on for a long time, and what can be coming out of you can be going on for years, or it can happen very, very quickly. Here, let me give you an example of my own life. Most of the mornings I wake up, have a cup of coffee, and I remind myself of the things of the scriptures, the good news of the gospel, and I get my heart in the right place, and I close my Bible, and I get up, and I'm done praying, and I'm in a happy place. I'm in a good place. My heart is governed and ruled by the gospel at that point in time, and for some period of time, good things are coming out of me. But very, very quickly, I can find myself reacting badly, very quickly, defensively, and annoyed and impatient and such things. And my wife may say to me, why are you getting defensive? Well, I might have defended myself in previous times, but now when I hear that word defensive, I think, well, why am I behaving defensive? Well, I'm proud, but my heart is far from the Lord. And so it's very helpful for me when my wife or somebody asks me, well, why are you getting defensive? And now I understand why I'm getting defensive, because my heart is far from the Lord. And that's why I'm bearing bad fruit. When your heart is bad, whether it's been bad for a long time or for a short period of time, the results are still going to always be the same. There's going to be an absence of love and joy and peace and kindness and gentleness. And in that place are going to be bad things like being rude, quarreling, fighting, getting defensive, annoyed, raising your voice, attacking, critical, judgmental, and all the things that we do when we find ourselves getting defensive. So here's why are we what are the two reasons then why we get defensive? Number one, we saw last video was we got proud, and we see today that we get defensive because we're far from the Lord. So the conclusion of the matter today is that it's crucial that you not only see and understand these things, but you begin to own and take ownership for what is coming out of your mouth. And in this case, quarreling, fighting, and being defensive and annoyed and reactionary. It's very important that you see that as a heart problem, and that is your heart problem, and that your heart is bad. Okay, that's the first step. Now, in our next video, which will be defensiveness number 4, we're going to talk about if we've come to the point of understanding now that we get defensive because we're proud and our hearts are far from the Lord. Well, in video number 4, defensiveness number 4, we're going to look at what we do next and how we can correct it. Okay, that'll be quarreling and fighting number 11 and defensiveness number 4. Look forward to talking to you then.